Anyways, my name is Garnett Genuis, as was mentioned. This is my wife, Dr. Rebecca Genuis. We met each other on the internet. Any other Catholic match couples out there? Okay, a couple. I also dated her cousin beforehand, though, so I'd already met the family and everything. When we first met, I was unemployed and she was a medical student. Now she's a doctor and I'm an MP, so I'm just as useless to society as I have always been. And I know with 5 children, that's a relatively small family given the standards of this conference, but we have now a 12-seater van, so stay tuned. Thank you.
Funny try.
This is really at home, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So Rebecca and I share a common outlook on life, but we're also living very different vocations. So we're going to try to cover a lot of ground today by sharing different aspects of how we live our vocations. But there is a common thread that will hopefully come through. And here it is. Rebecca and I, like all of you, are trying to live as Catholics in the midst of what is obviously a very particular point in our cultural history. So what are the things about this cultural moment we're living in, and how do we live in it? That is the question that, regardless of particular vocation, that all of us need to, in some sense, answer. So first off, if we're going to talk about living as a Catholics in these times, what exactly are these times? The great Catholic New York Times columnist Ross Douthat recently wrote a fascinating book called The Decadent Society: How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. Although I don't agree with everything in the book, I think it's a really important book for our times, and I would highly recommend it, as really introducing this concept of decadence into the political conversation. I think that decadence is a good general framework for thinking about these times that we're living in. So what is decadence? It doesn't mean that everyone is super rich or having a good time all the time, but it gives the sense of relative wealth and pleasure leading to distraction, irresponsibility, a hyper-focus on the attainment of pleasure, and a general focus on the irrelevant. Like if Rome is burning and I'm sitting in my basement eating chocolate cake and discussing my preferred pronouns. That's what decadence looks like. I know where the applause lines are going to be now, so it's the chocolate cake, right? Everybody loves chocolate cake references. So, but our politics and our society are increasingly defined by a love of pleasure and a decline of courage. So much so that while in other places and times many people would die for their convictions, many of our leaders today will fold on matters of principle simply in order to avoid a stern talking to or a slight increase in social tension. Our celebrations of sexuality are now more extended and prominent than our celebrations of our history or our military. And our stories generally celebrate the pursuit of pleasure and personal authenticity instead of courage and sacrifice. A particular decline in discussion and emphasis on the virtues of prudence, courage, and temperance demonstrates this rise in decadence. You still hear a lot today about justice, about faith, about hope, about love, but the necessary teaching in prudence, courage, and temperance is what is most evidently lacking. That is, the importance of seeing the world as it truly is, the importance of risking oneself and other goods to pursue greater goods, and the need to control one's appetites in the pursuit of the good. These tough cardinal virtues associated with strength are the ones most obviously in decline in a decadent society. The famous Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said the following about his observations of the West during a speech at Harvard all the way back in 1978. He said, "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our day. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. Political and intellectual bureaucrats show depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in theoretical reflections to explain how realistic, reasonable, as well as intellectually and even morally worn it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. Should one point out that from ancient times, declining courage has been considered the beginning of the end." Given the trajectory we have followed since 1978, Solzhenitsyn seems quite prophetic. I think our society has unmistakable features of decadence that make us vulnerable to decline. At a societal level, we face a myriad of different kinds of problems, but many have their roots in this decline of courage as well as prudence and temperance. Now, to give you a sense of what real and historically normal courage looked like, I want to read you this great passage from City of God by St. Augustine, in which he shares the story of a particular pagan Roman general. But among their own famous men, they have a very noble example of the voluntary endurance of captivity in obedience to a religious scruple. Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general, was a prisoner in the hands of the Carthaginians. But they, being more anxious to exchange their prisoners with the Romans than to keep them, sent Regulus as a special envoy with their own ambassadors to negotiate this exchange, but bound him first with an oath that if he failed to accomplish their wish, he would return to Carthage. He went and he persuaded the Senate to the opposite course, because he believed that it was not for the advantage of the Roman Republic to make an exchange of prisoners. After he had thus exerted his influence, the Romans did not compel him to return to the enemy, but what he had sworn he voluntarily performed. The Carthaginians put him to death with refined, elaborate, and horrible tortures. They shut him up in a narrow box in which he was compelled to stand, and in which finely sharpened nails were fixed all around him so that he could not lean upon any part of it without intense pain, and so they killed him by depriving him of sleep. So that is courage, right? To argue for the interests of Rome ahead of his own, and then to return to a tortured death in order to keep his oath. Now, if that sounds very foreign to us, it's because it is. Of course, there are many examples of this in Scripture. Probably most poignant to me is the martyrdom of a mother and her 7 sons in 2 Maccabees 7. Before proceeding, there's a spider on here. I'll just deal with that. Thank you. Speaking of courage, right? There's some things that are just too far for me. All right, so okay. Anyways, before proceeding to describe the gruesome tortures, the chapter begins, it also happened that 7 brothers with their mother were arrested and tortured with whips and scourges by the king to force them to eat pork in violation of God's law. One of the brothers, speaking for the others, said, "What do you expect to learn by questioning us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." So a little more than a microaggression was happening, right? And again, if this sounds sort of otherworldly, it's because it very much is. But I think it's important as we kind of take stock of what we're living through, that we not be down or depressed about these times that we're living in. In fact, we should enjoy them in certain respects. Because in eras characterized by a decline in courage, those who cultivate a real propensity for courage and sacrifice actually have much more of an opportunity to have a determinative impact on public and social life. When others are weak, you must be strong. For example, if you're sitting in a meeting and everyone's a little bit cowardly, everyone's passively waiting for a consensus to emerge, then provided that you're the first one who's prepared to speak up and speak out boldly in defense of your position, then you're more likely to carry the day than if you were in a room full of people who were similarly bold and confident. Being a person of courage, living in our time, in a time of declining courage, may be a little bit like entering your car in a foot race. Step up, work hard, take advantage of the situation, advance your principles in a time when fewer other people are bothering to do the same. Of course, a decline in courage also affects our own communities. It affects good, well-meaning Catholics. It leads people to abandon friends in trouble instead of challenging them with ideas about how they can improve their lives in a spirit of genuine evangelism. It leads to people abandoning family connections and obligations over trivial disagreements or in order to preserve their psychological comfort. It leads people to abandon the public square or to keep quiet about the injustices they see around them. It leads to people opting out of contentious political conversations for fear of hurting feelings. It even leads people to abandoning their parishes instead of having frank, respectful, and necessary conversations with their local priest. Too many of us avoid important, direct, and substantive conversation or action, not because we fear for our lives, but simply because we fear discomfort. So if you want to make the world around you a better place, if you want to impact the direction of politics or some other sphere of life, then you need to grow some courage, get off your couch, turn off Fox News, and confront the problems you see in the world, rather than just talking to people who already agree with you and feeling quietly superior in your knowledge about the problems that society faces. To live as a Catholic in this decadent world is to cultivate and practice the virtue of courage by doing hard things, awkward things, and things that do not come naturally to you in order to advance the common good. It is to draw from the example of the saints in knowing that pursuing eternal happiness requires a relentless willingness to accept pain and sacrifice in the present. Okay, but what then? Once you've said, yes, I want to be involved in my community, I want to step up, I want to have a determinative impact on my friends, my parish, my community, and public life in general, then at that point, what do you do? When people think about decadence, I think they most naturally think of that late Western Roman period, or chocolate cake, but I think of the late Western Roman period, right? At that time, elites were living highly decadent life, so decadent that people would actually eat and then cause themselves to vomit simply so that they can eat again. When Dr. Rebecca comes up, she's going to tell you not to do that, by the way. That's not good for your health. But just as a show of how decadent their lives were. Meanwhile, things were kind of breaking apart. Barbarians were coming in further and further. It was an empire in decline, no longer able, in the midst of its decadence, to resist these barbarian invasions. But the decline of the Western Roman Empire was also an interesting and exciting time to be alive. Two of the greatest thinkers of antiquity, St. Augustine and Boethius, thoughtful and genuinely courageous men, were able to write such beautiful and profound things because they had the rich tapestry of an exploding society against which to contrast their reflections. So let Augustine and Boethius be your inspiration. The challenging times are no excuse for leading mediocre lives. Now, what was happening during that time that I think was quite interesting was that as civilization as a whole was declining and cracking, the church within that civilization was growing and building. While the church did not manage to prevent or reverse that broader trend of decline, it was still building something new inside of that declining civilization. So that just as a snake sheds its skin, the decline and death of the Western Roman Empire eventually revealed a new European civilization that had been growing underneath. And as Europe entered the early Middle Ages, as chaos reigned in the wider world, the church continued to do its work, planting monastic outposts, evangelizing the pagans, preserving and passing on the intellectual heritage of antiquity, creating new orders, new clubs, new stories. There's a place for confronting the culture, but this was actually primarily a work of construction rather than confrontation. I think of those early monks, not all of them made it, right? You'd have these monastic outposts created, and some of them would get overrun by Vikings, but eventually the Vikings would be converted by the constant witness and the building out and passing on of knowledge that was happening. It was a work of construction. The work of Catholics always, but especially in times of decadence, is to build beautiful things that last. Again, I think the work of Catholics always, but especially during periods of decadence, is to build beautiful things that last. And that's similar, or perhaps a more concrete formulation of this idea that it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Rebecca and I see our primary mission in the chaotic and decadent world that we sometimes see around us as being trying to build beautiful things that last within that wider world. In my political work, that means trying to build legislative proposals, speeches that pass on ideas and knowledge, but also build communities and networks of people who are themselves true, good, and beautiful, and which seek to advance the true, the good, and the beautiful in our national life. Of course, as a father, I'm also trying to build with Rebecca a strong and beautiful family. We hope that our family will be a part of that legacy, that will be a beautiful thing that lasts. Rebecca's, of course, doing the same. She's very much the lead on the home front. In the case of our family, we kind of describe it as she's the CEO, she's the heart of the home, and I'm the pointy end of the spear, the one that's more likely going out and poking things, right? So, so on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Rebecca, who's going to talk about the work she does building beautiful things that last in our home, and then I'm going to come back up to share some concluding thoughts. And I'll try not to take your notes with me as I do them.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Fantastic. So it really is a pleasure to be here with you all. We've been to Family Life several times, and I think of it really as one of the joys of the summer in Edmonton, in the Edmonton area. But today I'm excited to be here and talk to you a little bit about some of the building that I sort of see myself as being involved in my personal life and my professional life as well. So I want to talk a little bit first about building within our families, and specifically building traditions in our families. I think, and perhaps as Garnett alluded to a little bit, one of the marks of our families is that we try to be quite intentional in almost everything we do. We recreate intentionally, we parent intentionally, we eat intentionally, we spend our money intentionally, and we're always sort of thinking a little bit about what we're doing and if it's sort of serving the purposes we hope it would be, and then evaluating that afterwards. And a lot of that intentionality is really centered around what I think mine and Garnett's greatest desire is, which is that together with us, our children would fight for and would attain heaven. And I accept, of course, that free will means that that's not something I can 100% control. But it's with this goal in mind that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and observing my role in encouraging this in our family. And I've really been doing this most of my life. So I think when I was like 19 or 20 years old, 21 or 22 years old, I was in medical school, and I had this preceptor. So everyone who knew his family, who I met, would not want to tell me what a great doctor he was, but actually what a great father he was. And they would tell me about his kids and so on. And so one time I said, Dr. So-and-so, can I ask you a question? And he said, sure. And I think he was expecting me to ask him about the treatment of endometriosis or PCOS. But I said, can you tell me how you parent your kids? Because I just keep hearing really good things about them. And I've done that, I think, since I was a late teen, because I observed families where the parents had a deep and sincere faith and the children maybe didn't always. And so I've asked this question a lot, and really a lot of what I'll share with you today is based on the things that I've heard repeatedly in those conversations. One of the things that has really stood out to me is the importance of family culture. Since I've moved out to Alberta, I'm from Ontario, I've really had the joy of peering into some families of 4, 6, 8, 10, whatever it is, children, but larger families than I grew up in. And one thing that has struck me repeatedly is that particularly in families who are focused on passing on their values, but even in large families that maybe aren't, these families develop a unique family culture. And I think that this happens because when you have that many children, you just can't realistically tend to a ton of super unique needs. So, in a family of 2 children, God bless them, it's possible to explore each one of your child's interests, to facilitate regular play dates with their particular friends, maybe to cater to meal preferences and so on. But when you have some critical mass of children, at some point a parent's ability to do that is just maxed out. And so in a sense, there's this inward turning of the family. They learn to entertain each other, to befriend each other, to meet each other's needs, to find commonalities, and really to live their common life with some degree of harmony. And I'm obviously not casting a vision of families being isolated, but I think that there's a sense in which the members of your family, your nuclear family, can become a really significant part of your community. And this, of course, was the traditional way of life before industrialization. Families as their own micro-communities, cultivating their land, meeting their needs, and then perhaps joining up with larger families or communities at church once a week. I should also say, though, that this model is entirely possible regardless of the size of your family. I had 2 sisters growing up, but I think because of the common strong emphasis on family in Indian culture, I look back and realize that my parents also developed our family culture extremely well. We spent a lot of our leisure time together. Friends were important, but never the most important. And my parents regularly and obviously manifested their love towards all of us. So my primary attachment was certainly always to my family and not to my peer group. And this was very protective for me, particularly when my feet started to wander. So, given the importance then of building a strong family culture, I think one of the questions we can try to ask is, how intentional have you been in developing your family culture? There's this book by Joseph Pieper called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And, I've heard great things about it. I've ordered it off Amazon. It's sitting on my bookshelf waiting to be read, which perhaps is a common story amongst you. But I'm going to propose today that the basis of family culture is our traditions. And I mean traditions in a fairly broad sense that would also encompass our habits. Matthew Kelly says that we become the stories that we listen to, and our lives are a story we're telling our children. So I think it's worth it to be intentionally telling a story instead of just letting it sort of unravel on the path of least resistance. I think we have to be noticing what's happening in our families right now in terms of the habits we have intentionally or unintentionally settled into, and we can also sort of observe our children's expectations around certain activities or holidays or practices as indicators of the traditions that we've built, whether on purpose or not. And then, of course, we consider if these are contributing to the family culture we want or not and adjust as needed. So a few examples maybe from our family. We sort of have a daily rhythm that's fairly flexible, but includes some touch points of prayer to just try to keep us in God's presence. We pray a morning offering individually when we wake up. We say grace before our meals. We say the Angelus at lunchtime. And our evening prayers consist of a rosary, a sung litany to our name saints, some spontaneous vocal prayer, and an examination of conscience. Now, occasionally, the evening gets away from us, and we don't have time to say a family rosary. But when this happens, it's usually met with significant protesting from my children. Now, while I do admit that this may be nothing more than a delay tactic on their part for them going to bed, it has often been the case that those nights when I go to check in on them before I go to bed, I find a sleeping child with a rosary in their hand because that's an important part of their evening. So, that's sort of our daily plan of life that they expect and that, is something that is part of our family culture. In our week, Sundays are special days. So in the morning, the children sort of take care of each other and let Garnett and I sleep in, which is a tradition I highly recommend you build in your families. But then we go to Mass and our son altar serves, so everyone knows we have to leave a little bit early so he can get suited up. And I wish I could say we had a habit or a tradition of behaving perfectly piously at Mass, but children have free will, so we don't. But after we have, wrangled our children for an hour while trying to unite ourselves to the Lord, we come home for Sunday brunch. And this is sort of an institution in our family. So whether I'm, pregnant or tired or whatever it is, if I try to get away with something less than the usual Sunday brunch, then again, I'm told about that. So Garnett and I also do our best to stay away from our professional work on Sundays, and the children know this. So if we try to sneak into our home office and get a bit of work, we're quickly dragged out of there and lectured about how it's our day of rest. And while, at times this is inconvenient, it is a reflection of the culture that we're trying to build that sets the Sabbath aside as a day of rest. When it comes to seasonal traditions in our family, I have really loved and embraced the idea of liturgical living, and so we strive to embrace all the different seasons of the church in their fullness. We fast and we feast and we remember the goodness of God through it all. We also celebrate 3 special days for each member of our family: their birthday, their baptism day, and their saint day, which is from Kendra Tierney and something that works really well for us. Celebrations tend to follow a fairly similar and predictable formula in our house. We go for Mass in the morning. We're homeschoolers, so maybe we do a little bit less schoolwork at home. If it's your special day, you get to pick what we have for dinner, and then we have dessert after dinner instead of fruit, which is our usual. At the dinner table, we try to talk about whatever the day is that we're celebrating, and if it's a day of spiritual significance, then we would add in a litany or a prayer that's sort of relevant. Again, this is a formula that works for me. It doesn't take a ton of extra effort. We have to eat anyways, but it still makes the day notably different from every other day. Quickly, I'll say in terms of food and dessert, we do have certain days where we eat certain thematic foods. On the Annunciation, we eat meatballs that have a small piece of cheese hidden inside them to remember how Mary beheld Christ in her womb and no one else could perceive him there. Of course, one year I tried to make these meatballs and the cheese all leaked out of them all over the tray, and my children were crushed that Jesus was not hidden inside of the meatball. And so every year on March 25th, I get told, Mom, make sure it doesn't happen this year, which it hasn't since, thanks be to God. On Easter Sunday, we make an Easter tomb out of Rice Krispie treats, and we have Duplo figures to represent the risen Christ and the women at the tomb. Recently, we celebrated the Solemnity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, so we have, strawberries with chocolate shavings that look like the Sacred Heart, and so on. I'm sure many of you have seen these things on the internet, and there's all kinds of wonderful books. So you don't have to come up with them on your own, and they're not hard to do, but I think they matter. My warning to you, though, is that if you have older children and you do something memorable one year, they will remember. And the next year, you will have to recreate whatever it was you did the year before. But honestly, I think that's a good thing. I have this idea that if my kids ever were to wander away from the faith, they wouldn't be able to forget that every year on St. Gianna's feast day, we ate Italian food. And on Pentecost, we had birthday cake for the church, and so on and so forth. So I think that's why we should think of these traditions, not just as fun things we do to celebrate, but as true anchors, as things that can help us and those we love to stay the course and perhaps to call them back should they drift. They're worth thinking about and instituting in your family life because they build up a family culture that I have observed and experienced to be protective in passing on our values. Another thing that I think we need to be intentionally building in our families is a way of responding to life and all of its curveballs with joy. I think all of us know that the most important way that we'll form our children is through our example. And so if we want them to be people of joy now and as adults, it's our responsibility to model that ourselves. And as a melancholic, I can tell you that doesn't necessarily come naturally. But what has worked for me is having a lens through which I see everything that happens in my day, whether, I'm annoyed by traffic or broken dishes or crying children or late appointments. Whenever I'm angry or annoyed or exhausted, what works for me is to stop and remember that I'm loved by the Father who is all-powerful, and there's nothing he can't do. I've often seen him turn all the red lights green when I'm late for something, or make that unreachable person answer my phone, or point me towards paperwork that's been lost for a little while. So he does intervene regularly in my daily struggles, and so if he doesn't, then I accept that too. I've decided that I have to face whatever happens in my day, vomit, missed deadlines, extra laundry to fold, whatever it is, with joy, because I trust my Father who can do anything. And I think that if I hope for my children to be joyfully obedient to me, then it's important that I'm regularly examining myself for how I'm joyfully obedient to my Father. So while most of my interior life is just that, it's interior, sometimes it does become a little bit more noticeable in our family. I don't really know how this started, but in our house, if a glass or a plate falls on the ground and it doesn't break, I often say, "Thank you, Jesus," out loud, just a small bit of gratitude for one less mess in the day. But it's funny how kids pick this up, because my son, I think he was like 2 years old when he noticed this happening, and he suddenly just would start exclaiming loudly, "Thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus," when anything fell on the ground, whether it smashed or didn't. But that's the nature of children, right? And it was a good reminder to me even. So, but the other thing that I think we try and do in the context of cultivating joy is if my children are angry or upset, we talk about offering their sufferings to God. And it's interesting really to me how differently different children will respond to this. Like for some, you just say it and great, they offer their suffering to God and it's over, but for others it doesn't always. And so normally I'll first ask them, like, is there someone that you really think needs God's blessing right now or needs a special gift from God? And sometimes yes, sometimes no. But often when their emotions are so high, like they just can't get there in terms of thinking something. So sometimes I try to offer them something to latch onto. And, I might have a patient who really needs prayer, or Garnett might have a big project that he's working on. And often as I talk about that and they realize that they can contribute, that's sort of a game changer for them. My 7-year-old told me the other day, "That's the real trick of all this, Mom. You get to help someone else and you also feel better yourself." And I was like, yeah, that's totally it. But joy is important. It makes our lives so much more fun. And, you and I think, might look ahead and we might wonder what the world is going to look like when our children are grown up. And we could be tempted to worry about their future. But because of the cross, joy and suffering can coexist. And I think that's what we need to be building into our children. I remember when I turned 18 and I was able to vote, and I started to wonder, how am I going to decide who I vote for? And at the time, I was surrounded by people who were skeptical of most politicians' sincerity. Now, I've learned since then there are some good ones, but at the time, I remember thinking, how will I decide? And so I thought, perhaps what I should do is I should try to learn something about the character of these politicians. So I would try to read a little bit about their personal lives or how they had made certain decisions and whatever it is. And then I thought, okay, maybe if they're a person of character, then I can trust that whatever situation they face, maybe they'll make the right decision. And so that was sort of my framework. But today the world feels like it's changing rapidly. And so we don't know what challenges our children will face, but for the sake of their holiness and also just their ability to survive the unknown with their faith intact, I think we need to be intentional about teaching them to face their lives with the joy of knowing that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. I will quickly say my thinking on a lot of this has been profoundly influenced by Bonnie Landry, who's one of the coolest people I've met and had a chance to learn from. She has a great podcast called Make Joy Normal, so it's all in the title, right? But the first season is mainly about homeschooling. The rest is about just parenting and joy, and so I suggest check it out. Okay, finally, I was really delighted today to be asked to speak a little bit about my professional work too. So I get to share a bit about that. I'm a functional medicine physician and I work with women and couples to help them get pregnant, stay pregnant, and have healthy children. So this falls under building healthy families. Right now we're seeing really significant rises in the rates of infertility that young healthy couples are experiencing. 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 couples in Canada are being diagnosed with unexplained infertility. And I'm sure that many of you here, whether yourself or you have family or friends friends who have experienced this, you know what an emotional and challenging journey this really can be. I will say too, though, it's not just infertility. Our children today are less healthy than they were before. We're seeing significant rises in the rates of, anaphylactic allergies, but also autism, ADHD, asthma, many other illnesses are rising. And, honestly, if that's what it was, then that would be it. We would roll the dice every time we got pregnant, and then we would love and do the best we could for the children we got, and that would be the end of the story. But in my view, the coolest thing is that in the last few decades, tons of research has come out that's really starting to explain why we're seeing all these different things. And the good news is, in that almost every case, tons of these factors are modifiable. That is, it's not just our genes, it's actually our environment. It's things we can do something about. There's sort of a body of research that shows, it's called the knowledge translation research, but the time it takes from the time something is known, it's been proven, if you know any of the history of like lung cancer and smoking, it's the same story. From the time we know it until the time it really filters down and is put into practice, that's often 1 to 2 generations. And I sort of thought, that's a bit long for women and couples and children to be suffering. And so I spent all of my clinical time working in the area of what I call preconception care. I'll say, though, I have a cousin who's a priest with the Companions of the Cross, and he told me that their founder, Father Bob Bedard, encouraged all his priests to exercise regularly. He would tell them that if they had a vocation to be a priest, then they should be intentional about being a priest for as long as their efforts would allow them to be, and that included taking care of their bodies. And I think of this often in terms of my vocation as mother and physician. God has blessed me with these 2 callings, and the fullness of my response includes my efforts to be them as well as I can for as long as I can. When I have more energy, I'm a better mom. If I have less brain fog, I'm a better doctor. And if I don't get lung cancer when I'm 45, I'll do both for longer too. And so when I was early on in my training, I was really fortunate to encounter functional medicine, which is really an emerging field of medicine that seeks to understand the underlying causes of disease. And I jumped into this space of medicine because my observation of women's health in Canada was that it's really been suboptimal. If women have troubles with their cycle, they're offered the pill, or they're offered like the birth control pill or pain pills. If couples have trouble conceiving, they're not offered too much more than IUI or IVF. And of course, Catholics won't be comfortable with the large majority of these interventions, and so they're really just left to suffer. But since medical school, I've done a bunch of extra training, and I read a ton of research papers, and so I've learned a lot about what the underlying causes of these things commonly are. And it's been a real great privilege of mine to walk alongside many couples as they've discovered and addressed these causes and been able to go on and grow their families. For those of you who are in the preconception or interconception between children time, I do often encourage couples to get serious about their health in the months before they conceive. Because one of the coolest things that research is showing us is that the preconception period, so this is before you even conceive, in addition, of course, to the prenatal period when the child is in the womb, they're both actually foundational in the future health of your children. There is an article in 2018 published in The Lancet. So The Lancet is one of the top medical journals in the world. It said, we propose that the evidence for periconceptional effects on lifetime health, so the health of your child for the rest of their life, is now so compelling that it calls for new guidance on parental preparation for pregnancy beginning before conception in order to protect the health of their offspring. So, in my practice, if couples have had trouble conceiving, we do a lot of in-depth testing. The testing actually all gets sent off to the States because, we don't have labs in Canada that can even do it. But if that's not you, and you just want to optimize your health before you get pregnant, let me give you a few principles that you can sort of start to embrace right now. The first one is certainly good nutrition. We should try our best to eat whole foods that aren't covered with pesticides as much as possible. And then for women, taking a good prenatal makes a lot of sense. There's a real spectrum in terms of not every prenatal is equal, right? I've spent a lot of time also reading prenatal labels. And so I'll tell you 2 of my favorites. One is called Needed, the other one's called Seeking Health. I think my practice has some coupon codes, so if you find my website, I'm sure you can email us and we'll get them to you. But again, there's a paper that was published in 2022 that's casually started. Most women in the United States do not meet the recommendations for healthful nutrition and weight before and during pregnancy. But we spend very little time talking to people about how important this is. I often tell my patients, if I am building, if I want to build the coolest Lego creation, I want the bucket of 5,000 pieces, not the bucket of 50 pieces. But the same is true of our children. If you want to build healthy, strong, and robust children, then you need to be well nourished yourself. Aside from that, maybe two other things that I could offer. The second is to avoid chemical exposures in your lives as much as you can. And I'll just say, briefly, living in Alberta, filtering your air is probably the most important thing you should do in order to do that. Get lots of plants, but also if you're going to get a filter, Austin Air is probably one of the best ones out there. There's really incredible research showing links with air pollution and autism, air pollution with ADHD. Sherwood Park has one of the highest rates of asthma in the country, and it's likely because of some of the industry there. Of course, I'm very pro-industry development. It's just recognizing the risks, right? We don't live somewhere where we're going to have tsunamis or hurricanes or tornadoes, but our air isn't as clean as perhaps it could be, and so filtering your air makes a big difference because that's where you spend the majority of your time. Okay, and then the last one, which is maybe controversial, so I'll say this and then sit down, is electromagnetic radiation, so cell phone exposure in pregnancy. They found that women who have higher rates of cell phone exposure have higher rates of ADHD in their kids. And if you talk to a teacher today who's been teaching for decades, they'll tell you how different the classroom is today than it was before. And of course now the way phones are, right, when I was growing up, you made a phone call and then you put your phone down, but now it's right by the brain of the developing child. And I think it's making a really big difference in what we're seeing. So those are some things that perhaps you could start to embrace. I've published a couple of papers on preconception care. If you go to PubMed and type in my name, you'll see both of them, and they're open access, which means anyone can access them. And there's a lot more specific actionable things in there. But with that, Garnett, I think we'll wrap this up.
Thank you. The test papers are being handed out now, by the way, so make sure you took notes. No, thank you so much. How did an unemployed guy like me end up marrying Rebecca? This is a great mystery. But anyways, I think then for this final portion of the talk, I want to share a bit more about my vocation as a politician. I know we've covered a lot of ground, but hopefully it comes together in this sense of how do we build things that last in our personal lives, vocationally, and how do we impact the world as a result of that. So I'm a member of Parliament. What is that vocation? What does that mean? What does that look like? I'm a pretty ordinary guy. I don't really have any useful skills, so I was lucky to get this job. And it's a good job. What it is to be a member of Parliament is basically I get paid a salary, and I have an office budget, and my core responsibility, the core deliverables expected of me as a parliamentarian, is that I form opinions, that I express opinions, and that I vote in Parliament in ways that reflect those opinions. Essentially, I get paid to think and share my opinions. That's a pretty good gig. Most people have opinions and they don't necessarily get paid to express them. And I told my mother after I got elected that she owed me because I'd been giving her my opinion for free for about 28 years. And I hadn't previously realized I could get compensated for it. But in all seriousness, I think we understand that in practice, a person, regardless of whether they know more or don't know anymore, who attains a certain position or status and has an opinion, that opinion carries further and is more likely to influence the direction of society than a person who maybe hasn't, for whatever reason, attained that position. So I got elected, not because I want to get paid for my opinions, although it doesn't hurt. I got elected because I wanted the things that I believe to be right and true, those opinions to carry more weight and go further than they did when I was a private citizen. So for me, the attraction to being involved in the political process was not the political process as such. There are things about it that I enjoy, but for me, the attraction to it was a concern for the issues that are shaped by the decisions that are made in politics. There are so many different ways, obviously, that we can see through schools, healthcare, the kind of moral norms that are promoted, our security, profound ways in which our lives, the things we care most about, the things we hold most dear to us, are impacted by decisions that are made at the political level. Some people maybe join the military because they like the equipment or they enjoy fighting, but I think most join out of a sense of duty, right? You don't typically enlist because you like war, you enlist because you need your country to win. And a similar point applies to politics, that many people don't get involved because they like politics as such, but they get involved because the cause is so important. For me, I have found this to be a fun job, but there's a lot of personal sacrifice involved. So for our family, the routine is the House of Commons is in session about half of the weeks in the year. So when it's in session, I usually take the red-eye flight to Ottawa on Sunday night, and I fly back Thursday night. I rarely work less than about 15, 16 hours a day when I'm in Ottawa, and the work usually continues in some form on the weekend. Rebecca tells me to put my cell phone away for various reasons, but the work continues in some form nonetheless. So it's a good job, but it's a heavy job, and not just because of the workload, but also because of the challenges and pressures and experiences that you carry with you. The burden you carry of having met with people who are really struggling and suffering, and that maybe you're trying to help, but you can't always help in the way that they need it. This is a role in which you get to see the best and the worst of humanity. I've been really touched by the kindness that I've experienced from all kinds of people of goodwill in my constituency and beyond who support what I do. I've also interacted with literally some of the worst people in the world in the context of this role. I've had meetings with people that are involved in committing ongoing genocide. So that's a real spectrum to experience. But in the 8 years that I've been a member of Parliament, I believe I have been able to have a concrete impact on some of the issues that are facing the country. My political journey started with my own family. So my grandmother, very influential in my life, was a Holocaust survivor. Her father was Jewish, and she grew up in Germany, kind of the Munster area of Germany during the Second World War. And there were all kinds of things that she remembered. She was a person that was full of joy and happiness, but there were lurking memories that she had that would come out in various ways. Now, she survived the war in large part because of the kind of bold anti-Nazi political ministry of the Catholic Archbishop of Munster, the area in which she lived. He was blessed now, not at the time, but Blessed Clemens von Galen. And he was a bold, vocal critic of the Nazis. He would deliver these sermons that would contradict Nazi racial theories. And it kind of created a climate of resistance in the area that allowed someone like my grandmother, who wasn't Catholic, by the way, but to receive support and care, and she would kind of be hid out on farms for a few weeks at a time by people that were followers of, that were listening to these sermons of von Galen. And he's a real powerful example for me. I have a big portrait of Blessed von Galen on the wall in my Ottawa office. And there are a few things about his kind of political ministry that stick out to me. One, he was not a formally capital P political figure, right? He wasn't a minister in government. He wasn't an elected official. He was a bishop. But he used his position to speak about politics. He wasn't someone who bought into this lie that a person of faith and conviction shouldn't be engaged in the political process. He understood that concern for justice, for inherent human dignity, for the social teaching of the church required him to speak and to shape the environment in which my grandmother was living. He was a person of immense privilege within his society, right? He was from an aristocratic background. He had a real platform. He was also an ethnic German, very tall man, and very popular, very well known in the area, such that in the midst of his kind of criticisms of the Nazis, the senior figures within Hitler's command kind of discussed, what are we going to do with this guy? And they ultimately decided not to move against him until after the war, because his popularity and his stature was such that if they had moved against him or knocked him off, he would have, it would have made it more difficult for them to maintain the support of that area. So he had a position of status and privilege that allowed him to speak for justice, to speak for someone in the case of my grandmother who couldn't speak for herself. And a big part of what he spoke against, in particular, he gave these powerful sermons about euthanasia. He gave these powerful sermons about the inherent, immutable dignity of the person at a time when part of the Nazi ideology was to be killing people that were considered not useful to that society. So his words also obviously had great resonance at the time, but continue to have resonance today. The other thing about von Galen is that he wasn't a partisan in the purest sense, a partisan of any cause. Yes, he was a German, and he was proud of his German identity. And yet he was willing to criticize the German government. And in the midst of that criticism, of course, he became well known to the Allies, such that when the Allies occupied the Munster area, there were many Allied soldiers who were keen to meet him, maybe get photographs with him. I guess they didn't really have selfies at the time, but there was kind of an interest in meeting this bold anti-Nazi figure, right, who had been so courageous in challenging what was happening. But the Allied occupiers quickly became annoyed with von Galen, because once they took over, he started criticizing aspects of the occupation that he thought were excessive or unfair or overly harsh. And it wasn't that he created some kind of false equivalency. It wasn't that he said, well, what you're doing is just as bad. But he was always prepared to criticize injustice, whether it was on his side or the other side. He was always prepared to speak for justice and for universal human dignity in every case, in every single situation. So the experience of my grandmother, the stories she would tell us, stories about von Galen and others, always ensured that my siblings and I growing up knew that politics was important, knew that it was consequential, and knew that maybe at some point we would have an opportunity or an obligation to use our position, use our privilege to speak for those who, like my grandmother at the time, aren't in a position where they're able to speak for themselves. So this was sort of a big part of what initially kind of impelled me towards being interested in politics. Excuse me. So my father was a physician, and growing up, he did a lot of speaking and writing about medical ethical issues, euthanasia, as well as various other issues. And so these things helped deepen my interest in politics. And then in university, I was studying public policy. I was working in Ottawa. Excuse me for a second. Do you want to speak? I'm all out of water, so hopefully this lasts now. Okay, can you hear me now? We're good? Okay. The big step for me then getting kind of active in politics was that I was able to get an internship position on Parliament Hill. The Conservative Party at the time, and it's still running, they had kind of an internship program, a summer internship program that was able to facilitate people who weren't well connected, who weren't kind of part of an existing network, to be able to get a position and work in an office, maybe show what they could do, and also learn the process. So I gained from that just the insight about how important internships are, how important apprenticing the next generation, and how I benefited from that. So I got this kind of motivation from my grandparents, from my father, and the medical ethical work he did. And then also I was able to access politics through this kind of internship process. And then I came back to Alberta after that. I ran, I lost, I kept going, I ran again and got elected in 2015. And I think for a lot of people who are interested in getting involved in politics, this process can seem sort of very distant and very mystical. But the process for a person getting elected in our system is fairly straightforward. You don't have to have a lot of money. You don't have to have a lot of connections. The process for getting elected in a political party is signing up members to be part of your party and then getting those members to come out and vote for you. So it was a relatively small number of people within my constituency, after the course of about a year's work signing people up, that signed up to be members of my party, came out and voted for me as part of that process. And in various other times and places, I go into a bit more depth about just precisely that process of getting elected. I would just underline that if there are people here who think you might have a political vocation, might have an interest in running for office at the federal or provincial level, but also at the municipal and the school board level, which are critically important and shouldn't be neglected, it's probably easier than you think. It's probably a lot easier than you think. I meet sometimes with people that are interested in running for office, and they tell me, well, I have a PhD and I speak 3 languages, and I'm an executive at a company. What else do I need to do in order to be qualified to become an elected official. I said, man, you're about to be really disillusioned here about the kind of people running this country. But one of them's me. Sorry. If you want to run for office, if you think you might have a vocation in this area, my encouragement would be don't wait for some, mystical process of you being qualified to occur. The people that are qualified are the ones who win the most votes in the preceding election, right? And I think as people of faith, we have the advantage of strong networks of people we know who can come behind us and support us. Again, I really didn't have much background in anything else. I went out and sold lots of memberships, signed people up, and was able to get elected. In fact, recently I was telling my son, my 7-year-old son, about my roommate in Ottawa, who's another MP, Arnold Viersen, who was an auto mechanic before he got elected. I told him, did you know that Mr. Arnold can fix cars? He was an auto mechanic before he was elected. And Judah said, that's great, Dad, what did you do before you got elected? I said, well, never mind. Never mind. I would encourage all of you to who feel some prompting in this area to really think about it. There are lots of ways to get involved in the political process, to think about getting a position where you get to get paid for your opinions instead of give them away for free. But there are lots of ways to get involved that don't involve getting elected. You can consider doing an internship. We have now built up a great internship program on Parliament Hill. It's a year-long program from September to August. So if any young people, if you know young people that are interested in a career in politics, I would love to hear from them. I'd love to receive their resumes, and we can work on getting them an internship on Parliament Hill that will give them more training and experience in learning about how the political process works. If you don't want to run for office yourself, you can get involved in a local riding association. You can also, you can also work to get involved in one of the many activist groups that are here. I know the Justice Center is here, and there are many other organizations that are working to advance important principles and issues in our system. Okay, so. In conclusion, I want to say this, that all of you will either have a vocation or be in the process of finding a vocation. We presented today some of the specific backgrounds on our vocations. Of course, you need to find yours, and whatever it is, you need to work within that vocation to build beautiful things that last. If you think your vocation might involve political work or medical work, we would love to talk to you. For me in particular, as it relates to political work, my office is easy to find. We're always looking for young people who are interested in doing internships or people that want to get involved in the political process in various other ways. Again, it is easier than you think. The most essential way to build beautiful things that last is to invest in the next generation. Personally, that is by having children and raising them. Vocationally, it's by hiring young people who see the world in the same way and seek to support them to grow in their stature and influence within the same vocation. We have a saying in politics that personnel is policy. Personnel is policy. So if you claim to be in favor of something, but then you give positions and status and influence to people who are against those principles, if you elevate people to have more influence who actually don't believe in your stated principles, then your personnel choices are shaping the outcomes in terms of policy in ways that are contrary to your stated values, right? So preparing the next generation, both in your own family, but also by seeking to support and apprentice young people to come into your vocation, your profession, to have more influence is, I think, critically important for the future of our society, for building things that last. If you're a business owner, if you have some kind of management role, if you're in a position to hire young people, understand your responsibility to provide vocational opportunity and training to that next generation. Not just to raise your own children, but also to apprentice the next generation of Catholic young people so that they can be more influential in the vocation that you will share with them in that role. That's something that I try to do through my office, through the internships we run, and that's something that I would encourage everybody else to do as well. I say to Rebecca sometimes, my solution to every single one of the world's problems is to start an internship program, right? If there's some problem, start an internship program and train people to solve that problem over time. And just back to the main introduction, in a society where many things seem to be crumbling. In a society that seems increasingly decadent, where things are in trouble in various ways. If we are people of courage and of joy, if we use our courage and our joy to build beautiful things that last, and if we build up the next generation of Catholics to be bigger and more influential than we were, then just as the snake sheds its decadent skin, a renewed civilization can and will emerge. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity, and God bless.